Coshh and CLP labeling. Course aim: to enable delegates to identify potentially hazardous substances in the workplace and to understand the dangers of exposure to such substances. Learning objectives. By the end of this lesson, you will have a basic understanding of the employer's and employees' duties under the control of substances hazardous to health regulations. You will also recognise some of the health hazards which may result from exposure or contact with substances used in construction. What does Coshh mean? Coshh means control of substances hazardous to health. Coshh regulations require employers to control substances that are hazardous to health. You can prevent or reduce workers' exposure to hazardous substances by deciding how to prevent harm to health, carrying out a risk assessment. Legislation. Health and Safety at Work Order NI 1978. Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations NI 1999. PP Regulations NI 1993. Control of Substances Hazardous to Health Regulations NI 2003, amended 2005. DSEER, Dangerous Substances and Explosive Atmospheres Regulations NI, covers chemicals that may cause fire, explosion or corrosion of metal. REACH, Registration, Evaluation, Authorization and Restriction of Chemicals Regulations 2006. And CLP, Classifying, Labelling and Packaging of Chemicals Regulations 2015. Substances hazardous to health. Appeared firstly in 1980s. It was the first legislation about chemical substances and ill health. First legislation to talk about risk assessment. Covers chemicals, products containing chemicals, fumes, dusts, vapours, mists, gases and biological agents, and it has undergone a lot of changes. To comply with Coshh NI, you need to follow these 8 steps. Step 1. Assess the risks. Assess the risk to health from hazardous substances used in or created by your workplace activities. Step 2. Decide what precautions are needed. You must not carry out work which could expose your employees to hazardous substances without first considering the risks and the necessary precautions and what else you need to do to comply with Coshh NI. Step 3. Prevent or adequately control exposure. You must prevent your employees being exposed to hazardous substances. Where preventing exposure is not reasonably practicable, then you must adequately control it. Step 4. Ensure that control measures are used and maintained. Ensure that control measures are used and maintained properly and that safety procedures are followed. Step 5. Monitor the exposure. Monitor the exposure of employees to hazardous substances. Step 6. Carry out appropriate health surveillance. Carry out appropriate health surveillance where your risk assessment has shown this is necessary or where Coshh NI sets specific requirements. Step 7. Prepare plans and procedures to deal with accidents, incidents and emergencies. Prepare plans and procedures to deal with accidents, incidents and emergencies involving hazardous substances where necessary. Step 8. Ensure employees are properly informed, trained and supervised. You should provide your employees with suitable and sufficient information, instruction and training. Coshh assessment. Identifying hazard and assessing risk. You're probably already aware of many risks in your trade or industry. A Coshh assessment concentrates on the hazards and risks from substances in your workplace. Remember that hazards and risks are not limited to substances labelled as hazardous. Steps to making a Coshh assessment. Walk around your workplace. Where is there potential for exposure to substances that might be hazardous to health? Examples include processes that emit dust, fumes, vapour, mist or gas, and skin contact with liquids, pastes and dusts. Substances with workplace exposure limits are hazardous to health. In what way are the substances harmful to health? Get safety data sheets and read your trade magazines. Some substances arise from processes and have no safety data sheet. Examples include fumes from welding or soldering, mist from metalworking, dust from quarrying, or gases from silage. Look at the Health and Safety Executive web pages for your trade or industry. What jobs or tasks lead to exposure? Note these down. Note down what control measures you already use. For these jobs, how likely is any harm to workers' health? Are there any areas of concern, for example, from the accident book? Examples include burns from splashes, nausea or lightheadedness from solvents. Examples of hazardous substances. Gases: carbon monoxide, chlorine, acetylene or carbon dioxide. Fumes: welding, soldering, diesel or rubber. Dusts from brick, wood, soil or flour. Liquids: acids, alkalis, peroxides, mercury or wet cement. Vapors: white spirit, MEK, toluene or isocyanates. Solids: nickel, cadmium, man-made fibers or refractory ceramic fiber. And biological agents: Weevils or Legionnaire's disease. Here we have some pictures of persons who have been involved with biological agents. We can have either fungal, algae, bacterial, or viruses. Identification and sources of information. We must make sure our labels comply with CLP. Manufacturer's information, supplier's data sheet, web assessment data sheet, or information from the Health and Safety Executive. What is a Material Safety Data Sheet, or MSDS? It is a document that provides workers with procedures for safely handling or working with a particular substance. The information available from an MSDS data sheet is extensive. It covers composition, information and ingredients, hazard identification, first aid, firefighting, accidental release measures, handling and storage, exposure controls and personal protection, physical and chemical properties, stability and reactivity, toxicological information, ecological information, disposal considerations, transport information, regulatory information, and other information. What is Health and Safety Executive Guidance EH40? EH40 contains a list of workplace exposure limits for use with the control of substances hazardous to health regulations. Approved for use with the control of substances hazardous to health regulations Northern Ireland. The latest version of EH40 2005 has been updated to include new and revised workplace exposure limits introduced by the Occupational Exposure Limit Values Directive. It will guide those responsible for controlling exposure to hazardous substances at work. In EH40 guidance. Controls are said to be adequate if exposure is reduced to levels below those specified in the HSE publication EH40. Formerly shown as occupational exposure limits and maximum exposure limits, now known as workplace exposure limits, there are only around 500 substances who have WELs. TWA stands for time weight average, and LTEL, long-term exposure limits, which is over an 8-hour period time weighted average. STEL stands for short-term exposure limits, over 15 minutes time weighted average. CLP regulation. The European Regulation number 1272/2008 on classification, labelling and packaging of substances and mixtures classed as the CLP regulation, came into force in all EU member states, including the UK, on the 20th of January 2010. The CLP regulation adopts in the EU the globally harmonised system on the classification and labelling of chemicals. Applies directly in all EU member states. This means that no national legislation is needed and is overseen by the European Chemicals Agency. The intention of the CLP regulation is very similar to CHIP. Substances and mixtures that are placed on the market should be classified, labelled and packaged appropriately. But because CLP adopts the GHS, in time the same classifications and labelling will be used throughout the world. Coshh hazard labelling. The chemicals, hazard information and packaging for supply regulations were revoked from the 1st of June 2015 and no longer have legal effect. Chemical suppliers should comply with the CLP regulation. In 2015, another phase of the EU classification, labelling and packaging of substances and mixtures regulation began. All chemicals created from June had to be packaged with the new globally harmonised system, which comprised of red diamond pictogram signs outlined on the accompanying pages. For chemical blends, which will be the normal shape in which chemicals arrive at most working environments, new creation runs should likewise bear the CLP labels. However, suppliers are permitted to exhausting stocks with the old hazard notices in orange squares until 2017. Safety phrases. These phrases are divided into three categories. General. If medical advice is needed, have product, container or label at hand. Keep out of the reach of children and read label before use. Prevention. Keep container tightly closed and use only outdoors or in a well-ventilated area. And response. Examples include get medical advice or attention if you feel unwell, or fight fire remotely due to the risk of explosion. Of caution. The new signs may be accompanied by one of two qualifiers. Danger for the most hazardous substances and mixtures, and warning for less serious hazards. One new sign and pictogram is that for contains gases under pressure. The gas cylinder image resembles a wine bottle or cricket bat. This is a new category under CLP. You're probably already familiar with the old chip hazard symbols that appear on some chemical labels. These symbols help us to know that the chemicals we are using might be explosive, oxidizing, highly or extremely flammable, toxic or very toxic, harmful, irritant, corrosive, or dangerous for the environment. One or more might appear on a single chemical. These symbols have been replaced by others because the law on chemical classification and labelling has recently changed. The new symbols, called pictograms, show similar images, just a slightly different shape and colour. Storage examples. Under the Coshh regulations, items may have to be stored in separate storage areas and specific locking cabinets. Here we have some examples. Routes of entry into the body. We have inhalation, ingestion, skin absorption, or invasion. For example, puncture. Of exposure to chemicals in construction to your health. Examples include cancer, asthma, bronchitis, silicosis, asbestosis, damage to the nervous system, burns, blindness, heart disease, affects your DNA, damage to embryos, fires and explosions, nausea and fainting. Dust and the effects. Results of entry into the body. Causes. fibrosis from asbestos, coal, silica, plastics and talc. Acute effects include bronchitis and asthma. Chronic effects may be fibrosis, cancer including nasal cancer and asthma, and heart failure. As we can see from the two pictures, dust in construction activity is unavoidable. The silicosis effect is therefore everywhere. Limits. Dust is considered to be a substance hazardous to health under Coshh if it is present at a concentration in air equal or greater than 10 mg meter cubed for inhalable dust, time weight average over an 8-hour period, or 4 mg meter cubed for respirable dust, time weight average over an 8-hour period, as a substance hazardous to health. We will now move on to the basics of silicosis. It's a disease which scars the lungs, causing shortness of breath, fever, fatigue, and loss of appetite. There are three types of silicosis based on the amount of exposure and length of time. Chronic, which occurs after 10 or more years of mild overexposure, the most common of all types. Accelerated, develops between 5 to 10 years of moderate overexposure. And acute, can develop within weeks or up to 5 years due to breathing very large amounts of silica. Of wood dust. Wood dust contains more than 7,000 species of bacteria and fungi. Your working environment, like your body, is filled with a vast variety of microbes, many of which live in dust. In a study of wood dust from 1,200 working environments, the dust in each contained an average of more than 5,000 species of bacteria and 2,000 species of fungi. Below are some types. Red cedar cause asthma, dermatitis, and septic wounds. Mahogany, asthma and dermatitis. Walnut, asthma, dermatitis, conjunctivitis, and rhinitis. Teak, dermatitis, eye inflammation may both become serious. And satinwood, dermatitis, coughing, and headaches. MDF. MDF is a pulverized softwood and urea formaldehyde resin, both potential health hazards. MDF produces very fine dust during processing, and the dust particles act as a carrier of absorbed formaldehyde to the lower airways of the lungs. Wood dust and formaldehyde together have been reported to cause respiratory irritation with symptoms of dryness of the throat, rhinitis, and eye irritation, as well as occupational skin disease. It's important protective measures for wood dust exposure should be followed when MDF is used. Occupational dermatitis. Definition: a non-infectious inflammatory skin condition resulting from external contact with biological, chemical, or physical agents, caused when the outer layer of the epidermis and greasy glandular secretions are compromised. There are two types: contact and sensitization, and it accounts for 70% of industrial diseases. Two common causes of dermatitis: contact with substances like greases, solvents, cement, acids, alkalis, and other such agents. Recovery is possible if you can avoid contact. Or as an allergic response, those affected must avoid contact with the agent. Chemical burns. If you work with concrete, you already know how abrasive, alkaline, and caustic it is. To put it simply, as Portland cement dries, it will absorb water from any source in order to harden. That means it will suck the moisture from your skin as well. It can also cause serious burns because of its alkalinity. Alkali burns to the eye. The exception is a hydrofluoric acid burn, which is as dangerous as an alkali burn. Acids usually damage only the very front of the eye. However, they can cause serious damage to the cornea and also may result in blindness. This is one of the most common acidic burns of the eye. Mutagens are also covered under the Coshh regulations. What happens is we mutate our DNA. The DNA molecule is destroyed and is no longer able to carry out its function. Infections. What is Weil's disease? Weil's disease is caused by a bacterial infection caused by Leptospira bacteria. Initially, infection is termed as leptospirosis, and if the infection spreads to involve vital organs of the body, such as the brain, heart, lungs, kidneys, and liver, then it is termed as Weil's disease. Examples of those at risk: water or sewage workers, farmers by rat contamination of winter feeds, dairy workers, anyone involved in water sports and leisure activities, vets, meat inspectors, butchers, abattoir workers, or waste disposal operatives. Legionnaire's disease. Legionella grows in water temperatures between 20 degrees C and 45 degrees C. Symptoms include muscle ache, headaches, and a fever followed by a cough. Confusion, emotional disturbance, delirium may follow the acute phase. The fatality rate is 12% in the UK. It can be treated using specific antibiotics. Viral infection. Hepatitis caused by some organic solvents or virus. Transmitted from infected feces, hepatitis A or E. And transmitted from infected blood, hepatitis B, C, or D. RIDOR. The Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrences Regulations, Northern Ireland 1997, places a legal duty on employers, self-employed people and people in control of premises to report work-related deaths, major injuries or over 3-day injuries, work-related diseases, dangerous occurrences, near-miss accidents. Since the 1st of April 2013, employers have the option to report all work-related incidents to the Health and Safety Executive NI, no matter who the relevant enforcing authority is for the business. Health and Safety Executive NI, in agreement with local councils, are now offering this new service in the hope that it will make it easier for employers to report incidents at work. This is especially relevant where it is difficult for an employer to determine who their relevant enforcing authority is. Health and Safety Executive NI will process all forms onto its ruler database and, where applicable, forward on relevant forms to the appropriate district council to register and process in the normal way. Although revised RIDOR reporting requirements were introduced in Great Britain in 2012 and 13, the position in Northern Ireland remains unchanged. Here we have a hierarchy of control measures for keeping employees safe. Elimination, substitution, enclosure, local exhaust ventilation, dilution ventilation, reduction of persons exposed, housekeeping, training, PPE, welfare including first aid, health surveillance, and reduced exposure times. To summarise, today we have discussed the control of substances hazardous to health regulations, EH40 guidance, Coshh assessment, health surveillance, routes of entry into the human body, dust health hazards, biological health hazards, hierarchy of control, and RIDOR. This concludes our somewhat condensed Coshh and CLP labelling course. The full version is available to book through the CITB NI office, either for training carried out in your workplace or on the mobile training unit. Thank you for your time and attention from the team at the CITB.